Good evening et bonsoir. I'm Yolande Chan, Dean of McGill University's Des Hôtels Faculty of Management, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. Before I start, let us acknowledge that McGill University and we now are on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which we now work, play, and live. I'd like to extend a very warm and special welcome to tonight's speakers. Fanny Dosset, BCom 09, Managing Director and Head of Scotiabank's Sustainable Finance Group, and Laurie Carr, Chief Executive Officer of FinDev Canada, and someone I've been privileged to know for about 2 decades. I would also like to welcome our panel moderator, our own Sébastien Berthermier, Associate Professor of Finance at Des Hôtels and Faculty Director of the McGill International Portfolio Challenge. And you are distinguished guests in attendance, here and online. Thank you for making tonight's event a priority and for participating in our discussion on the road to net zero. This event is part of the Integrated Management Symposium series. Many of you know that the school is named after Marcel Des Hôtels, and he is the benefactor of this series and of, in some ways, tonight's event, which kicks off the 6th annual McGill International Portfolio Challenge. Most of you refer to this as MIPC. MIPC, and I'm saying this not just with pride, I'm saying this with empirical validation. We are the world's premier, in many ways, student-led challenge on portfolio construction and institutional investing. And I will give credit not to me, but to Professor Berthermier, whose research focuses on pension funds, retirement systems, and sustainability. It's an incredible opportunity for students, professors, and industry professionals to come together, learn about and debate the future of sustainable finance. Events this week bring together about 100 students from 25 finalist teams from around the world to compete for $50,000 in cash prizes. That's remarkable. In total, 96 teams from 21 countries and 6 continents participated in this year's challenge. To all of you students, you are tomorrow's leaders. You are the ones, even more so than I, who will shape the future of this industry and our future collectively, globally. Over the last year, a team of 10 undergraduate Des Hôtels students worked very hard to organize this week's event along with Professor Berthermier. And I would just like to ask the MIPC team to stand. Please stand so we may acknowledge your efforts. I'm very, very proud of you. I'm very grateful to you, your work, and this community. What you do is known far beyond Montreal. I travel globally, and people speak to me about MIPC and about this event almost wherever I go globally. So merci, and you've done very, very well. And I'm looking forward to what you do this week. And I will say in advance that some of us have an event that will start fairly shortly, so you will see a couple of us slip out. But we know it's being recorded, and we look forward to enjoying it now and after the fact. And with no further ado, I'll start the event by welcoming Professor Sébastien Berthermier to the stage, and he will introduce our guests. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Dean Chan. Welcome, everyone. I'm actually going to invite Fanny and Laurie to come and join me as we start, and I'll speak about you while you're sitting here. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to all those of you watching us online. This is, as Dean Chan mentioned, the opening ceremony for the 6th edition of the McGill International Portfolio Challenge. We have 96 teams, 21 countries participating for $50,000 of cash prizes, and the grand finale will be live streamed. The top 5 teams competing for the top prize. You're more than welcome, all of you, to come and watch it. If you click www.mipc.ca, you'll get the link to the grand finale from about 9 a.m. to about 1 p.m. It's fascinating, the type of quality that we receive from the competing teams. This year's competition is very much on net zero. How to design a net zero pledge and a decarbonization strategy. In this case, we're looking at Australia, at one of the big super funds. That's how we call the large pension funds in Australia. And so that leads a question for tonight, which is, well, what does the road to net zero look like? What are the roadblocks to net zero? Right? And that's going to be the theme of today's symposium. Now, we have 2 top speakers to join us today to speak about this theme. We have Fanny Doucette, as Dean Chan said, our own McGill grad coming back, and I'm very impressed by the stellar growth that you've had. Fanny today is the managing director and the head of sustainable finance at Scotiabank, one of the large Canadian banks. And we also have Laurie Kerr. Welcome back to Canada, Laurie. Laurie just joined FinDev Canada as CEO about a year and a few months ago. Laurie is an expert on development finance, on sustainable finance, especially in the infrastructure world. Prior to Montreal, Laurie came from Washington, where she was involved at the World Bank, at Climate Finance Advisors, at IFC Corporation. And so it's a pleasure to have you with us, Laurie. So what's great about this panel is not only do we have 2 top speakers, but we have a head of a private bank and a public bank, right? And this is going to be great because that's going to provide a lot of complementary perspective about how do we get to net zero and how do we mobilize resources effectively, right? So the way we'll proceed, we'll have the panel discussion. We'll take, roughly speaking, about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have an interactive Q&A. Now, the Q&A, the way we'll format it is you're more than welcome to submit your questions to Slido. This is what we've been using. It works really well. Right? And then we'll have Greta read to us your questions afterwards during the Q&A. And so those of you in the room, you're more than welcome to even log in on the Wi-Fi network and enter the questions as we go. And I'll bring back that slide afterwards. And then those of you listening to us online, likewise as well, you're more than welcome to enter questions. All right, so the agenda for today will go into 4 parts. The first is let's have a bit of a progress update on net zero. Then we'll talk about the banks, the role of banks, public and private, in leading when participating in the transition. Then we'll talk about how to design effective carbon reduction targets for employers, for large investment managers, and then we'll talk about meeting the targets and getting your insights all along the way. Okay? So first, let's provide a little bit of context. And here it's not going to be as fun for the next several minutes. I have 2 charts that I want to share with you that have really influenced my thinking on the topic, and they're not pretty. But we need to see them. That's the reality staring at us. The first one is what I find to be a fascinating chart that links the cumulative stock of carbon emissions in the air with the level of temperature increase relative to pre-industrial levels. Okay, so how much stock of carbon there is and the expected temperature increase. And what you see is a remarkably linear relationship. That's important because it means that if we want to target 1.5, let's say, degree, which has been one of the big targets, well, that tells us how much stock of carbon in the air, right, is going to cause that. And that's, roughly speaking, about 3,000 gigatons of CO2. What's a little scary is we're not too far away from there. I mean, we're at 300, where the remaining carbon budget, if you will, is about 300 gigatons of carbon CO2. That's not much, meaning we're actually quite close to the 1.5 target. What's also scary is if we look at the second chart, and this is showing us over time the evolution of the annual carbon emissions per year in gigatons, where right now, at least in 2019, before the pandemic, we were at about 35. Again, we have a carbon budget of about 300 left, and we're using it about 10% per year. That means that in about 5 to 10 years, if we continue at this pace, well, we're going to meet this target and maybe more, right? Now, 2020, we had the pandemic. Right. So the pandemic, well, we stopped traveling, we were confined, so that should reduce, right, the overall carbon emissions, and it did, but not by much, by about 5%, 6%. And then, well, we're all back. Now after the post-pandemic recovery, well, we're back to where we were at about 35 gigatons of CO2 out there, so we're exhausting our budget. And what's scary is if we really need to go to net zero, and have the 1.5 degree targets, that's the slope at which we need to decrease our emissions year after year, right? So the carbon decrease during COVID was about 6%. We need to do 8% per year, every single year from now to 2050. That's what it means. Now, that's to me is a scary thought, given the fact that we're still quite dependent on our current lifestyle. Right, so for those of you who like skiing, I mean, this is steeper than the double black diamond here, right? This is serious. Now, Laurie, Fanny, I'll start with you, Laurie. You're both on the ground. You're financing hundreds of deals, traditional deals, green deals. You're seeing what's out there. Can you tell us what is your view on our progress to net zero, and perhaps based on the progress to date, where we're headed so far?
Georgetown University for about 14 years, and it's really great to be back on the university campus. So thank you so much, McGill, for inviting me here. Really, really great question. Taking stock in terms of where we are right now. I guess I would start by thinking about, you know, are we going far enough? Are we going deep enough? Are we going fast enough to meet our net zero target? And I think that we've got a long way to go. Where I would start with sort of assessing where we are, I kind of look at it at a number of different levels, or a number of different sort of aspects. The first one would be where are we on our goal setting? And as you mentioned, sort of the international goal is the Paris Agreement. So we have the 1.5 goal. And from that 1.5 goal, countries have a role, and countries have set their nationally determined contributions, so they've set goals at the national level. And then third, we've got corporations, asset owners, asset managers, banks, public financial institutions that are setting goals. We've got the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, an association of a number of private sector actors that have come together. So they're setting goals. And then individuals, all of us, we can set goals. What are we going to do? How did we get here today? So there's goal setting on a number of different levels. So the first thing is setting goals. And where are we? If you had to rank, where are we on setting goals? So the pessimistic side of me says, wow, we're kind of at a 0.5 because look at this chart. Like we've set a goal, we've set goals, and if we look at all the goals that have been set, we're not going to keep at 1.5. So the optimist of me says it's a huge boon that we've actually made goals, right? So maybe we're at a 7. So maybe overall globally we're at a 7 in terms of goal setting. not high enough, deep enough, fast enough, but we're maybe at about a 7. And then after we look at the goal setting, then we need information. We need information. How are we actually going to achieve those goals? What are the pathways to decarbonization? So we need a lot of information. And there's lots of initiatives out there. As I mentioned, GFANS is one, and the different associations that make up GFANS. There's a lot of information that's being prepared and circulated and analyzed to help figure out what are these decarbonization pathways at the national level, at the corporate level, et cetera, at an individual level. So information, where are we on that? Probably 5, I would say. There's still lots we don't know, but what we do know, we can have a huge impact on the goals that we've set. The third piece is incentives, and where are we on incentives? We need both sticks and carrots, right? We need sticks to make action, and we need incentives to sort of impel action, if you will. And globally, I would say we're probably at a 3 or a 4 in terms of incentives. I mean, Europe has been very forward-leaning. Some countries have been very, falling very far behind. So maybe globally we're on about a 3 or a 4 in terms of incentives. And then the last one would be, measurement and accountability. And where are we on that? I would say low, unfortunately. Globally, I mean, there's certainly lots of internal stakeholders and shareholders that are trying to keep accountability, but this is the big accountability, and we haven't gotten there yet. So I think overall globally, the accountability is really low as well. So if we look at sort of the different pieces that would make up and how are we going to get to net zero, how are we actually going to achieve this, goal setting, information, incentives, and then accountability. We've got a long way to go further, faster, deeper, to be able to keep 1.5 alive, as they were saying last year in Glasgow. But I'm an optimist. I have to be an optimist. One has to be an optimist when you're in climate and the sustainability field. So I think we can turn those numbers around. And I would hope that next year at a symposium, if we were talking about the same thing, I would like to ratchet up those numbers and say that we're actually on a much better trajectory to be showing a little bit of a different slide here. So a long way to go, but I'm optimistic that we can affect change.
What about you, Fanny?
Yeah, and I would say, well, first of all, also thank you, Sebastian, for having me here. And not sure if the mic is working or not. It's working. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for coming here. It's certainly fantastic for me to be back on the McGill campus again after so long. But I mean, Laurie, I think you put it in very nice words in terms of the progression of where we go. For me and my background, I've been in sustainable finance for the last few years. My background before that was in more traditional finance. So a little bit newer to this space than you are. And the way that I see it, the momentum in terms of setting goals and setting targets really picked up over the last 2 years, leading up to COP26. And it was tremendous, the amount of like you said, target setting, goal setting that we've seen. We have about 85% of emissions right now are covered by countries that have set net zero ambitions. About a third of publicly traded companies have set net zero emissions targets. Of course, net zero by 2050, that's in a long time. So there's quite a bit of work to do in the near future, but a lot more focus on it now from all levels, from the public side, from the private side, which for me is really, really great to see. And I am an optimist as well. I do believe that when people come together for a common goal, that there's a lot that we can achieve. And so I very much look forward to the next few years. I think generally we've been in a period of target setting and goal setting, and the next couple of years is action. You've set your goals, you've set your targets, what are you going to do about it? And we're certainly seeing it from the investor side are asking companies about that. I know even Scotiabank as a public company, we get asked that question a lot. What are you doing to achieve these goals and these actions? And that is what the next few years is really going to be focused on. And with that, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And if you are a true capitalist, you know that with opportunity, there will be money and there will be people that come to take advantage of that. But I think, Laura, you touched upon a great point in terms of incentives. So it really does require a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. We do need more incentives to really bend the curve and get this going quickly. A great example is that the Inflation Reduction Act in the US was a tremendous piece of legislation that passed. With everything that is included in that, it's estimated that the US could reduce emissions by 42% by 2030. That is huge. That is huge. And so we need a lot more of those bold legislation, bold steps taken by governments and the public to incentivize the private sector as well.
So let's talk about actions. Banks play a critical role in the ecosystem as capital providers, both to traditional industries, to new renewable energy, green industries. In your view, could you elaborate, and I'll start with you, Fanny, the role of private banks in this transition to net zero?
Yeah, it's a really I hope you can hear me. So it's a very unique role that banks play in this transition. As you know, Scotiabank is a major global bank with operations across many countries and multiple continents. Yet our emissions footprint from our own operations are actually quite small. And so, you know, we're definitely committing and trying to lead the net zero we're trying to be leaders in it and reducing our own footprint. We've committed to be net zero in our own operations by 2030, so well ahead of that 2050 date. But that's not where a bulk of our emissions come from. When you think about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, most of our emissions fall into that Scope 3 category, where it's the emissions of the products that we offer. The products that we offer is financing, so our financed emissions. That is where a lot of our emissions come from. And that puts us in a really unique position where, you know, there's great things we can do with our own operations, but we really have to work with our clients to help them through the transition. We have to be there, I think, as capital providers. We have to be advisors, we have to be influencers, and we really have to put ourselves out there to help our clients. So it is very different, but very exciting, because we actually get to work with clients across our global footprint, across multiple different industries, and help them with their transition process. So it's a really important role, a really influential role, but it is quite different than when you think about it from a pure corporate perspective that just looks at it from their own operations.
Now, when we look at a public bank as opposed to a private bank, you don't have the same number of depositors, you have one big client, the government in a way. What is the role of a public bank in relation to private banks in the transition?
Sure, and I'll just pick up something that Fanny said that also does apply to us. Even though we are a public bank, we're a capital provider. And in our case, as a development finance institution, we're supporting private investments only in emerging markets. So we don't work domestically in Canada or in developed markets. We support investment, both domestic investment, mobilizing international investment into emerging markets and developing economies. So in that way, we're a capital provider. We provide both debt products as well as equity products. And we need to, from a corporate perspective, maybe just to mention a couple of things, we also have a net zero well, it's not even an aspiration. We're net negative right now. Now, it's a very beneficial place for us to be in because we're a new institution. We've only been around 5 years, but we are net negative, and that's something that we wish to keep up. We have a number of forestry investments that have allowed us to do that. We don't finance oil and gas, and so that is something that's part of our corporate culture, part of our values, and something that we're very proud of, and that we're going to continue doing that going forward. We have a very much a client-centric approach, as Fanny was saying as well. We're working with our clients, again, these are clients in emerging markets, to help them make good decisions and direct our financing to perhaps green outcomes as well. So I think that part of being an influential player with the capital that we have to support our clients in making good decisions of the investments that they're doing is something that I think we share in common. We're just coming at it from different parts of the ecosystem.
So since the two of you are here, both public bank, private bank, I'm actually quite curious to explore how to effectively mobilize large amounts of capital for large, complex green projects that involve perhaps both collaboration by public and private banks. So this is an example that you see here, the largest wind farm in Mexico. It was created back early in the 2000s, and right during the global financial crisis, it fell apart. There was a lack of financing coming in, and the IFC stepped up. One of the big public banks in the US, IFC stepped up, provided some secured financing to attract private capital again, and it worked. It worked, and actually led to a large growth in the renewable energy industry in Mexico. And so building on what you just described, Laurie, can you speak perhaps, and I know you have experience with these projects, perhaps in this project, or more generally, how blended finance in general can help to mobilize large amounts of capital for the transition?
Indeed, no, and I'll certainly pick up on this example, and just maybe to level set for everyone in terms of what blended finance is. So blended finance is the use of public resources in a catalytic way to mobilize private investors. And in this particular case, as you mentioned, Mexico is a boon for the wind energy industry, and in the early 2000s, it attracted a lot of attention from international wind developers, Iberdrola, Gamesa, Acciona, et cetera. We're really looking at how to exploit the wind energy potential there. And the government had taken great strides, instituted a new regulatory framework to support the development of wind energy. However, even before the financial crisis hit, which was really kind of the advent of blended finance solutions for these types of projects, there was a little bit of reticence, there was a little bit of lack of confidence, there was a little bit of skepticism on, okay, this is a new regulatory regime in Mexico to support the wind. Is the government going to stand by it? What's going to happen that hadn't been tested before? So there was a lot of concern over really kind of the longevity and the validity of this regulatory system even before the financial crisis. And then when the financial crisis hit and international banks pulled out, the developers were left with, 4 gigawatts worth of pipeline, but nowhere to finance it. So the IFC, together with the Inter-American Development Bank, which is the regional development bank focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's where I was working at the time with colleagues from the IFC. And so the IFC and the IDB, two public multilateral development banks, we came together as institutions to help the wind energy sector in Mexico. And not too long before that, the climate investment funds were created. The climate investment funds were, the predecessor to the Green Climate Fund that people may be aware of. And it was really kind of a game changer in terms of bringing big pools of public sector catalytic capital to the fore to help incent and address the risk-return imbalance that private sector, the private sector needed to invest in emerging markets. So there was a particular fund under the climate investment funds called the Clean Technology Fund. And both the IDB and the IFC tapped into about $50 million. It was about a $200 million project, this one, the La Ventosa in Oaxaca, about $50 million in concessional finance from the Clean Technology Fund, and blended that with investment from their own balance sheet, which basically achieved an appropriate risk return for that private sector developer and allowed this wind project to go to fruition. That model was replicated a couple of times, and that really opened up the wind energy sector in Mexico after the financial crisis. The regulatory framework was proven to work at the time, and that just unlocked billions and billions and billions of dollars of private investment in wind energy in Mexico, sort of in that late 2000s period. So it was really a great example of public sector and private sector coming together, trying to find solutions, in this case for bringing renewable energy onto the grid in Mexico, and a really amazing case study in the very early days of using blended finance, and was really quite a success.
So, am I right in thinking that what I find is fascinating with this example is here's a long-term project, here's a risky project, let's bring the public sector to take on some of that risk-bearing capacity for projects with a lot of social value, as well as a long-term horizon, which the public sector can better afford than the private sector. And by structuring the deal in a way that allows essentially private sectors to come and deploy capital under a risk-return framework that is more feasible.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was. Okay. So indeed, I mean, this was under a project financing, structure. So there was a long-term offtake agreement, but even with that, there was still real and perceived, amounts of riskiness associated with the project. So even though there was kind of a long-term offtake contract, as we call them, for the wind energy with the utility, there was still a lot of concern. And knowing that this was a long-term project, the investors were willing to go so long. The public money was able to come in through the IF3, through the IDB, with a little bit of a longer tenor to be. Combine that with the concessional piece that took a subordinated position in the overall structure, but it was really able to take additional risks. The public money was able to take additional risks that the private sector wasn't able to take at the time, and again, really provided that demonstration effect that opened up the sector in the years to come.
And what about you, Fanny, from the private sector? What perhaps maybe your experience or your view on these types of projects?
Yeah, and I think overall a key piece of this discussion, and it's such a common theme for this net zero discussion overall, is the concept of collaboration. And I think we've talked about that already in terms of, countries having to come together with net zero goals, companies having to come together, everyone has to work together, including the public and private sector, and blended finance is a fantastic example of that. As a private bank, we still, and you guys both have mentioned it, we still have to operate within our typical and required risk and return framework. That is what we do, and there are a lot, especially on the infrastructure side, especially in emerging markets, there are a lot of projects that are really important, really needed, but might have too much risk or not enough return for private sector money, not just private banks, but just for private sector to be able to come in and to have public organizations be able to reduce some of that risk, whether they provide a guarantee, they provide a first loss piece so that if the project does lose money, they cover that first, or they accept only a little bit of return on their part of the capital, so the private capital can have a higher return, which falls within their risk return requirements, is really, really important. I think, there has been challenges with blended finance. A lot of these projects, and you see it when you talk about this example in Mexico, they're complicated. They can be big projects. This is an example of one. They can also be small projects, but either one, there's a lot of complications with the technology you have to understand. You have to understand the regulation in that country. You have to understand the wind that blows in this specific location. They're really, really nuanced, and they're very bespoke. And so what that means is, there's a lot of due diligence, a lot of work that has to go into it, and they're hard to replicate, and they're hard to scale. So that's been one of the big challenges, I think, for blended finance to really take off, is this concept of scalability for it. And so I do think we need some more work done. And I know, Lori, we actually found this out, we were chatting before this. You've done some great work on what's called the Sustainable Infrastructure Label, which I know not nearly as much about as you do, but it's certainly, I do think you should talk about it if you want. It's a great example of seeing a problem with blended finance, and a problem to unlock more capital that you and other organizations have done a lot of work trying to fix.
Thanks, Fanny.
I'm going off script.
That's okay. That's okay, right, Sebastian? But maybe I'll pick up on that, both on the sustainable infrastructure label, but also on the excellent point that you made around scale. So this is an individual transaction, right? Like, this project is a 70 megawatt wind energy project, which is great, but that's not scale, right? And so picking up on the blended finance for just a moment, trying to figure out how to mobilize private capital at scale by using blended finance is also something that we're very much working on. And so just to give an example how blended finance can be used at the transaction level, but it can also be used at the platform level. And FinDev Canada is working with a Canadian pension fund and a global bank on structuring a blended finance platform that will bring in some concessional finance in a first loss position to, again, address that risk return, the risk return appetite of the private sector. And those use of proceeds will be used for subnational infrastructure projects. So again, it's to support infrastructure, but it's a $1.2 billion platform. So it's mobilizing capital at scale into infrastructure. Now, portfolios are made up of individual transactions, of course, but we're able to actually create that platform so that those investors are not having to look at each individual transaction underneath that sort of delegated, if you will.
And on that platform, what are the best practices, if you will, that allow you to achieve that scale and allow investors to go in without necessarily looking at deal by deal? What are the key aspects of those deals that ultimately will bring the private sector at scale?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears, if I can be honest with you. I think the first thing is to find a good partner, and I've worked on a number of different platforms over my career, but I think that what makes this particular platform different that we're working on is the fact that we've found that partner, and we're really rolling up our sleeves together. They're committed, we're committed, and we've got really excellent communication. And FinDev Canada, so we're, as I've said, we're a development finance institution. And part of what we bring to the table is that broader sustainability framework. We're an investor and a financier that looks through a development lens, and we have 3 impact goals that we, hold high in every investment we make. One is gender equality and women's economic empowerment. The second one is market development, and the third one is climate action. So not only are we looking at climate action in that platform, we're looking at many of these other sort of sustainability type criteria, if you will, and the receptiveness and really the embrace of this partner in allowing us or embracing us to bring forward and raise the bar on sustainability in terms of the projects that are going to be financed, and to influence that quantum of capital, going back to the influence that Fanny was mentioning earlier, is really quite something. And really, I think both partners, all 3 of us around the table, are really quite proud of. It's not launched yet, but we're very, very excited about it. So I would say, good partners, very clear communication, and really kind of a roll up your sleeves attitude.
So let's continue the discussion and talk more about corporate entities and the design of effective carbon reduction targets. What's interesting when you're looking at the corporate net zero pledges is, one, they're very, very long term, 2050, 2060, 2070 sometimes. They vary in scope. So we have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and to give you a better understanding of what this means, if I take a firm right in a particular supply chain, so here's my firm, here's all the upstream activities in the supply chain, here's all the downstream activities in the supply chain. When you think about scope 1, that's really the emissions done inside the firm, right? Any emissions that are done just to run the business of the firm. That's very direct, that's the easiest to measure. But it's not all. You have scope 2 as well. Scope 2 is all the additional, oops, sorry, I went too fast. Scope 2 is all the indirect emissions, all the energy that is produced upstream to finance the firm's activities. And then you have scope 3, and scope 3 is the elephant in the room. Scope 3 is the full set of emissions by the firm, but all the suppliers and upstream, downstream on the supply chain. This one is capturing everything, but it is a lot harder to measure, right? And outside the firm's direct control. So the pledges, they vary in scope. And then they also vary in metrics. So you have what are called carbon reduction levels in absolute terms, and you get carbon intensity. So to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, absolute emissions, or let's say billions tons of CO2 emitted. So net zero is very much an absolute metric, right? It's a reduction of absolute CO2 emissions net of what we can absorb. But then we also have emissions intensity metrics. These are billions tons of CO2 emitted per, let's say, unit of GDP, or per amount of energy consumed, right? So it's how efficient I am in my energy production. And the distinction is important because if you look in Canada, you can see a clear downward path in carbon intensity. We've become a lot more efficient in our energy, but that doesn't mean that emissions have decreased. In fact, emissions have continued to go up, right? And so, well, now that goes back to my question, and I'll start with you, Laurie. If we take those corporate net zero pledges, what are best practices in your view for particular firms of how they should set their net zero pledges given the wide set of metrics and scopes that are at play?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think Fanny's going to go into a little bit more detail, but sort of as in general, how we would approach it is you can't manage what you can't manage what you don't measure, right? And so the idea of going back to what I said earlier in terms of is there information out there, what are the decarbonization pathways, but setting that baseline and really understanding, going back to your graphics, where do I fit, and how does everything I do, what types of emissions and when and how are those emissions created across my supply chain. So I think the idea of setting the baseline and really understanding what you're measuring and how to measuring is really kind of that first step.
What about you, Fanny?
Yeah, and I feel now a little intimidated knowing that many of you have been doing this for the last 2 months in your projects, figuring out how to set net zero pledges within portfolios. But certainly, and I'll look at it from a corporate perspective first, and because ultimately that's where most of the emissions actually lie. And Lori, exactly right. Like, you have to have the data first. You have to be able to measure it. And so you have to set a baseline. What is going to be your baseline year that you're going to measure progress against? So typically that's the last year that you can have data for. Typically, we also recommend having historical data before that baseline year. So again, you can measure a trend line, so you can get some information from that. Having data means having processes. And this is where a lot of the work comes from that I think people don't always realize at the corporate level. Getting the data and tracking the data requires a ton of work internally to be able to do and to be able to do right. And so setting up those processes might take some time. So you have the data, you have the processes, and then at that point, you might be able to commit to net zero if you feel comfortable. If you've done some work around that baseline and some work around where you think you can go, you could set some targets in the future. So targets for emissions reduction. And I know on this slide it says 2050, 2060, 2070. We hope that everyone is committing to net zero by at least 2050. And then to have interim targets, so before net zero, measuring against the progress, because we don't want to wait until 2049 to do all of the work. We usually recommend that corporates set targets every 5 years, usually starting in 2030. So that's the most recent kind of year that you're seeing a lot of emissions reduction targets coming from. We're starting to see 2035 targets now, so you definitely have to set a pathway for the future. There's a lot of information out there, depending on what sector a company is in, to do what's called a science-based target, which means your pathway of getting to net zero, how much you're reducing emissions every year, is actually scientifically aligned to being able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that is definitely best practice for companies to have science-based emissions reduction targets. Again, because we're trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degree. When thinking about, and you have up here scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, it really depends on the industry and the sector that you're in. So I already spoke about for Scotiabank, in terms of our scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 footprint, a lot of our emissions are in scope 3. So for us, it's important to have net zero and to have emissions reduction targets that include our scope 3, which we just announced our first targets earlier this year. So for companies where scope 3 is an important part of their emissions footprint, having scope 3 targets is really important. So think about oil and gas. A lot of the emissions come from actually cars, the fuel in cars, not necessarily from getting oil out of the ground. So scope 3 is really important. For other sectors like power, scope 1 is a bulk of the emissions. So it's okay to have just scope 1 and scope 2 because scope 3 is going to be relatively immaterial. So just because we talk about scope 3 a lot, how important it is, we really have to dig in and see who the company is, what sector they're in, and does that actually make sense for their business. We're really trying to focus on how can we make a difference to reduce real world emissions. And then the discussion about having intensity versus absolute reduction targets is another one that is important. And there's, of course, different viewpoints. The goal is to reduce real world emissions. We can't just reduce emissions intensity. Sometimes I do think about it that if we get to net zero emissions intensity, it means the numerator gets to 0, so they're one and the same in some way. But the reason that we see a lot of emissions intensity reduction targets is it provides a lot more information to be able to make decisions on. And Sebastian, you spoke about it a little bit. It tells you how you can be more efficient in terms of what you're doing, which just looking at absolute emissions can't necessarily do. So emissions intensity, although the focus should be reducing absolute emissions, gives people a lot of information. So we always recommend to have information for both. Your targets don't necessarily have to be for both, but have the data for both so that you're seeing it both on an absolute and on an intensity level as well.
So what I find interesting in what you're saying, it's very much of a pragmatist view on the situation where there's no such thing as setting a scope 1 or a scope 3 across the board. It's let's work with what the companies can achieve, their capacity to build a process, what they can measure, and build step by step so that we can have the right metric given where they are right now and what they can achieve.
Yeah, and what makes sense for their business
and what
too.
Makes sense for the business.
Where can they have the biggest impact should be the focus, at least for now. I do think over time we'll start seeing more and more absolute emissions reduction targets. Again, at this point, people are still more comfortable with that intensity. I think another key point about intensity, why we see a lot of corporates do it that way, is it reduces volatility based on size. So if you have companies that are acquisitive, that's going to have a big impact on your absolute emissions. Perhaps in 1 year you become twice as big. But you could be buying a company that is really efficient or really good and will transform the other part of your business. So again, it's about the information that you get from the two metrics are quite different.
Now, all that discussion is really about the corporate net zero pledges, but your banks, the case competition this year is very much about pension funds, right? What about investors? What about the investors' net zero pledges? Should we view them in the same way as the corporate net zero pledges? Investors own a portfolio of stocks. There might be some double counting once you start thinking in terms of scope 3. How should I think of pledges from an investor's perspective as opposed to the corporate side?
Yeah, and I'll kick it off. I think most of, what I think of the best practices for target setting and net zero, there's a lot of overlap between corporate and the financial community. A couple of big differences are, one is the data front. So I spoke about how important having good data is and how it can be hard for a company to do that. When you go out to, from a bank perspective, from an investor perspective, from a pension, you have to have the data for every single company that you're financing or investing in. So you're taking that problem and you're really multiplying it, which means you have a big data problem. You don't know if your data is good, you don't know if it's bad. So it makes it a lot harder to make decisions when you can't fully trust the data because it's not necessarily your own and you don't have perfect information. So I think that's one big challenge for financial institutions versus corporates. And then another big difference is your levers are quite different. And levers meaning how can you reduce emissions? That decision-making process is very different. You can't, for us, we can dim the lights. Most of our emissions come from the human capital that we have and the buildings that we're in. But besides that, it's influencing and collaborating with our clients, which is more interesting, but more challenging in a way itself. It takes a lot more work. So our levers are quite different than they are from a corporate perspective, where it's focused on scope 3, so we don't necessarily own the processes behind it, but we're certainly here to help and to influence with that too.
And what about you, Laurie? You were mentioning earlier that you are net negative as opposed to net zero per se. Is there a target on the net negativeness, or is that?
Well, that's a benefit because we've made some forestry investments.
Yeah.
So it's something that, again, we're really proud of. We're hoping to keep that net negative trajectory going forward, but certainly net zero is something that is part of our DNA. So, but going back to sort of the challenges, I think you Fanny, you said it very, very well in that it's for financial institutions, and it's really about that influence and how, going back to the theme of collaboration, how can we work with clients to help them put together credible decarbonization pathways, to help them with some of the data issues that they may have, and bringing a lot of, there's almost in some ways too much information, but what's credible or what's appropriate or what's industry specific. So helping boil down all of that, drinking from a fire hose, if you will, into something that makes sense, again, going back to your industry, where you are in the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera.
That makes sense and are actionable as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's talk more about collaboration, and let's talk now about the actions. Let's meet those targets. And as you said, Fanny, in the next few years, we should expect more discussion about the actions and getting the targets. Now, what's complicated is if you take any firm, it's not just a firm, it's a supply chain. And supply chains can be quite complex, right? From the very beginning all the way to the end. And so, from what I hear from you, I mean, the holy grail in many ways is to get all actors on the supply chain to collaborate, and that ultimately is what gets you a scope 3 reduction. Are there examples of what you've seen, examples that we can hope to see more of in the coming years about collaboration that ultimately can get the job done?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, and I think supply chain and the impact across the supply chain from this discussion on net zero is so important, and is one that we've been talking more and more. And we've actually been seeing a lot of collaboration between different types of companies across the supply chain to help each other. One, because they need to, because the world needs it, but also because they need to reduce their scope 3 emissions, because like I spoke about earlier, you don't own your scope 3 emissions. So you really have to influence others, your clients, or across your supply chain in order to get that reduction. And there's been some really interesting examples. One that caught my eye a couple of weeks ago was Rio Tinto and Volvo signed up for a partnership where Rio Tinto would provide Volvo with more sustainable products to make their cars, so lower carbon aluminum, lower carbon copper. And then in exchange, Volvo would provide them with more efficient hauling vehicles, so autonomous and more efficient hauling vehicles. So that's a great example where those two don't necessarily tie together, but those are two companies within their supply chains, and they said, let me help you and you help me, and we'll both be better because of it. So really great example. Another one that I really like is there's a private equity company that's focused on circular economy. And they brought a consortium together. I think it's called Next Gen Consortium, where it's a lot of food service companies. So think about your Starbucks, think about your McDonald's, those types of companies, along with packaging companies, and then recyclers and composters. And they're looking at specifically how to reduce waste in the food service industry. And their first project that they're working on is the To-Go Cup, which we're all very familiar with. It's really hard to avoid doing that once in a while, but they're trying to look at how to make a more sustainable to-go cup. So it'll benefit, of course, the McDonald's and the Starbucks of the world, because then their products become more sustainable, but it helps across their supply chain as well. And then another interesting example, and one a little bit closer to my home in Toronto, is Enbridge which is a large energy infrastructure company, and Waste Connections, which is a large waste management company. They've partnered to create a renewable gas facility at a major landfill in Ontario. And this facility will capture the renewable natural gas from the landfill, take it, and then put it in Enbridge's gas infrastructure pipeline and deliver it to homes to heat people's homes. So it's avoiding emissions going out into the atmosphere. So really great examples of collaboration, and we need a lot more of that. And I think from what I see, corporates and companies are really excited to do this, which I see that as very, very positive.
What about you, Lori, on the infrastructure side, which is perhaps the sector that you know best?
Absolutely. I was just actually going to pick up on something that Fanny said. Those are really, really, really rich examples. And we see similar examples in like the apparel industry and food services, as you've mentioned. And we're talking about, the two parts of the supply chain talking to each other and trying to find innovative ways to partner. Shareholders are requiring that as well in certain circumstances. But also, don't forget the power of the people, right? Like, if at the end of the day, the consumers, if that's what the consumers want, I mean, you vote with your feet, you vote with your wallet, and that then, that's kind of at the very beginning of the supply, or maybe it's the very end of the supply chain. But the power of every one of us to motivate with our market power, motivate these companies to do great things like that, I think is really shouldn't be overlooked. But in any case, going back, I think that this conversation is really interesting because Fanny's talking about the supply chain. If we take sort of that similar example and we look at the infrastructure sector and we look at it more as an ecosystem, if you will, and just wanted to draw sort of a couple of examples from the infrastructure space to round out the conversation, is if we look at what one would call, let's say, public service infrastructure. So the service, power, grid-connected power, the bus system, what have you. So these public services that are provided. Who makes the decisions? Who does the planning for those? It's governments, right? So whether it's a national government, a provincial government, a state government, a city government, governments are the ones that are generally responsible for deciding, hey, we need more renewable energy on the renewable energy on the grid, as opposed to other forms. We need more public transportation. And so government, even if they want the private sector to build, own, operate, finance, and invest in those projects, so the governments actually have a really huge responsibility in, again, raising the bar and setting those sustainability standards, right? So, we need more public transportation. Well, is the government going to require electric buses, or are they going to say diesel is okay? They have an LRT. How is that? What is that going to look like? They need power on the grid because of urbanization. Well, are they going to require that to be renewable energy power and not other sources? So we can't overlook. It's a supply chain in a different way. It's an ecosystem, really, but the importance of governments making good decisions to create the environment within which the private sector can actually invest, I think is really, really important. And we've got, I work in emerging markets, and we've got some really, interesting examples where governments have decided to, increase that sort of level of sustainability. For example, in Brazil, public street lighting, it's huge. There's more than 5,000 municipalities that need to provide public street lighting, and so changing those out and requiring energy efficiency bulbs, it's a tremendous investment opportunity. They could have said, same old bulbs, but they're actually having a really significant impact on the energy requirements because they've requested a higher level of technology in those bids. So there's a very important role for also governments to play, again, not just in the goal setting, but how they're actually trying to mobilize investment, particularly in public services.
Let's talk about let's talk about priorities. And this is my last question for tonight. Suppose you are being given $100 billion. It's a nice thing to have, but a hard thing to have. You have $100 billion to create a climate fund where you can have real impact, but you are financiers. And you look at it not only from a risk perspective, but also from a return and opportunity perspective, as you were saying earlier, Fanny. If you were to play around with a $100 billion fund, what would, for getting us to net zero, what would be your thought process about how to spend it, and how would you allocate it so that we can most effectively get to net zero in due time?
Yeah, I'll answer it in a couple different ways. The first way is, at Scotia, we actually do have a $350 billion commitment, where we are going to spend $350 billion or mobilize $350 billion over the next 10 years to 2030 for climate change exactly. So we are definitely very focused on this, and within this commitment, we do a lot of things like funding clean energy, funding green buildings, clean transportation, whether it's at the project level or at the corporate level, whether it's investments that we're making, financing that we're helping to happen, or just direct lending. We're also doing a lot, and this is a bit of a newer type of sustainable finance, at least in the last couple of years, a lot of financing where the cost of the financing is tied to whether a company meets or doesn't meet its ESG goals or targets. So a lot of these are the KPIs or the ESG targets are related to emissions reduction. So providing financial incentives for companies to actually achieve their emissions reduction targets. So we're doing a lot of work with respect to that. But if I had, in the way that I took your question, and you might not like it, was just a free $100 billion, not thinking about the risk or the return of it. But I think a lot of where we need to invest in is on innovation and on new technologies that will help us with the energy transition. The problem with a lot of this is a lot of the technologies as of yet unproven, so it can be risky. But I assumed you were just giving me a free $100 billion, so I'm going to put a lot of money into that. I think specifically, into carbon capture is really important. McKinsey came out with an interesting report earlier this week where they said that to achieve our targets, we need 120 times more investment in carbon capture than we have today. And that would equate to $130 billion a year into carbon capture. I think especially where we are today with the energy crisis and in a lot of different parts of the world, we are going to be using fossil fuels for the next little while. So how can we offset that and actually take emissions out is going to be really important. So I'm spending part of my free $100 billion in that. Another one, and sorry, there's so many of them, is I think, Lori, some of the work that you're doing in emerging markets, I don't think there's been enough money flowing to emerging markets, and they certainly need the support of economies like Canada, the US, and Europe to transition. We have to think about a just transition, and that emissions are global. And so more money in emerging markets. And the last one, I promise, that I'll talk about for my free $100 billion is one we've actually been spending a lot of time on this, is improving the transmission infrastructure. There's so much focus on renewable energy and the generation side, but we need the transmission to bring the power from those sites to people's homes, to businesses. And we need more reliable transmission. And so there's been a lot less rhetoric and focus on the transmission and distribution side, but I think that's equally as important as well. So I'll put some money into that as well. Sorry.
And so, assuming that you're giving us each $100 billion,
yes.
So I don't have to, so Fanny,
I took like 400, I don't know.
Exactly. This is a JV, we're bringing $200 billion to the table of free money. This is awesome. So if I were to complement all the things that Fanny were to invest in, I would go to coal transition to get countries off coal. A lot of the big emitters, South Africa, Indonesia, et cetera, the just energy transition partnerships, I would put money there, get them off coal. I'd dump a lot of money into R&D. Particularly in the hard-to-abate sectors, so steel, cement, glass, et cetera. Hydrogen, I mean, a lot more R&D money needs to be brought to the fore. And then probably the third area would be around land use. A ton of emissions are produced because of land use. So really going in and finding good solutions or rolling out existing solutions for regenerative agriculture, et cetera. But land use is a huge issue as well as forestry. So I think those would be the three areas. And if we were to use that $100 billion as a financial product, I think that in sort of the blended finance space, more money there, including with guarantees. Guarantees have a huge leveraging effect to bring private investment, particularly into emerging markets, where these are the countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis, and they're the ones that are suffering the most. So I appreciate that shout out, Fanny, for emerging markets, and I absolutely agree.
Well, thank you. This has been super insightful. We have time now for questions from you. And again, what I will encourage you to do is to enter your questions directly on Slido, and Greta, I believe, is going to read them to our speakers. And I think, Greta, you can already start to go ahead if we have some questions.
Yes. Oh, it works.
Where are you?
Sorry?
Where are you?
All right. Yes, we've had some questions come in over the course of the presentation.
Just come on in. Oh, no, because you have them in front of the
Yes,
computer.
unfortunately, I'm kind of tied to the side.
Greta, by the way, before you start, Greta is one of the members of the MIPC student team who's worked really hard for the past year in charge of all the logistics.
Yes, thank you for those kind words, Professor. Let's get started. First of all, great presentation, everybody. A very interesting discussion. We've had a lot of interesting questions come in, so I think we can start with, how do we make sure the net zero road includes local populations as opposed to hindering their livelihoods? For instance, displacements, loss of income, sources and land. Whoever would like to take that.
Sure, I can take that. So it's a really wonderful question, and I think that picks up on the last couple things that Fanny and I were talking about in terms of a just energy transition, so that no one is left behind in that. And certainly through the work that we do at FinDev Canada, other development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, looking at the impact of the investments that we're supporting in emerging markets certainly takes into consideration what's happening on the ground with our local populations. We've got standards. We all follow the IFC performance standards, which look at prior and informed consent with particularly affected populations, but looking at how investments are going to impact those on the ground, whether it's through services, whether it's through jobs, whether it's through displacement, is something that is absolutely part of what the development finance community and more private sector as well, private sector investors and financiers take a look at. So it's something that we hold very dear, hold very high. I feel like I need to look at Greta when I'm answering the question, so that's why I'm going like this, I'm sorry. But it is something that's very, very important, and it's something fundamental to our investment decision making.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well, and not much to add from my end. I think the concept of just transition is, especially important for Canada. So I think there's a lot of focus on it right now, which is really great to see.
And part of that just energy transition, picking up on your point about transmission and distribution, it's not just switching. It's not just having more renewables, but it's actually also creating access. So there's many parts to energy transition, and access is a huge issue. Again, in Canada, but also in emerging markets.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we do a lot of transactions within the power utility space, and including in the U.S., and a lot of transactions that we've been on recently for green bonds. So you think about green bonds for power companies, they're usually funding renewable energy. And on every single one of them, there's at least one investor that asks the question of how those companies are retraining their employees that were previously working in, a coal facility or a gas facility. What are they doing to actually support their employees and retraining them and pivoting them into new roles? So there's a lot of focus on. I think the question was about the local population, but also the individual employees themselves too, which is great to see.
Thank you. Greta, back to you.
Thank you. Our next question, I'll tie kind of two questions into one. The first is, in the current highly polarized environment, how big is the risk that governments are not able to control the possibility of greenwashing by corporates? And kind of going off of that, how can we incentivize corporations to keep comprehensive and quality data on emissions?
Yeah, and they're certainly very related. I think to answer the second one first, I think more regulation is needed, absolutely, and we're starting to see a movement towards that, towards standardization and more transparency. So I actually think we're really heading in the right direction. And in terms of the first one, what can governments do to prevent greenwashing? I'll be a little bit controversial here and say it's not really up to the government to prevent greenwashing. I think it's on everybody related within, and you use the word ecosystem, it's within everyone in the ecosystem, and I'll speak from the finance ecosystem. It's up to everyone to kind of help prevent greenwashing. It's up to the company or the entity that is doing it, but also whether it's the lender or the investor that's lending the money or investing the money to actually do their work and dig into it and see if they're okay or not. So I don't necessarily think, I think there's a lot of regulation that can help with that, but I think it's up to, in my opinion, the financial community to kind of come together and make sure that they understand what is happening under the hood.
Yeah, I don't think that's controversial at all, or maybe we're just both controversial, because I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that there is a role for regulation to minimize the risk, but all stakeholders have to keep feet to the fire, right? Again, whether it's consumers, whether it's shareholders, whether it's investors and financiers, but we all have a role to play in terms of preventing that. No, I agree with you.
Thank you.
Great. Going off of that, another question. You've all talked a lot about kind of what sector the responsibility falls in and how can, I guess we would all have to collaborate, but regarding collaboration, how can we better foster private, public, and voluntary sectors, so NGOs, partnerships to tackle net zero challenges using models like SIBs and DIBs?
I didn't understand the acronym. I'm sorry. Can you repeat what SIBs? I don't know what an SIB is.
Unfortunately, I do not either.
Okay. Does anybody know what an SIB is? Somebody at the back?
So how about...
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Now that
Yes.
we're talking about?
So we've talked a lot about collaboration. How can we better foster private, public, and voluntary sectors, so that includes NGOs, partnerships between those three to tackle net zero challenges using models like, social impact bonds. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll just take it as sustainable financing in general to help, and certainly, obviously, that's what my team does a lot of is sustainable financing. And interestingly, it's kind of related to the greenwashing concept in a way. And I was going to make this point before, but I kind of held my tongue a little bit. But I do think, personally, we've gone a little bit overboard with the greenwashing rhetoric, where there's a lot of things that companies are doing that are actually really good, and they're afraid to talk about it because now it seems like you're doomed if you do, doomed if you don't, that nothing that you say can be seen as positive. And I actually think that's going to put a bit of a hamper on the ability for companies to comfortably be able to do sustainable financing, whether it's on the social impact side, on the sustainable, on the green side, for fear that they might be called greenwashing, even though they can really stand behind the product that they're doing and the actions that they're taking. So I'll say that's one thing, is that instead of quickly throwing out the word greenwashing, to making sure sure that we're actually really thinking about what is happening. And I'm not saying that there isn't greenwashing happening. There definitely is, but there's a bit too much fear going on of greenwashing, and that's really unfortunate. There's a word that somebody recently used that's really interesting. It's called green hushing now, where people don't want to talk about the positive things that they're doing for the environment, because again, they're doing it and they want to do it. They don't want to talk about it for fear of the backlash that might come from that. And I think that can actually really hold us back. So that's one thing. I don't know if it answers one or both of the questions. One thing that I would say is to make sure that we're really looking into things before calling it greenwashing, to prevent green hushing.
Great. I like that. Well, I don't like green hushing, but I think that's a very innovative way of responding. Maybe to give a concrete example, and I'll pick up on what Fanny sort of segued earlier on about the sustainable infrastructure label, and I think that that's a really interesting example of collaboration, public, private, civil society, and what this is. There's sort of taking the cue from climate bonds, green bonds, sustainability bonds, et cetera, of creating a sustainable infrastructure label at the asset level. So, the thematic bond frameworks are for capital markets instruments, but this is a label that's actually attached to the asset, regardless of how it's financed. And essentially, I had the pleasure of co-leading this with Macquarie, and it was a several-year process, and it should be coming to market soon. And when I was wearing a different hat, but essentially what we did is we got together. I think at one point there were 70 different participants, and it was asset owners, asset managers, it was banks, it was multilateral development banks, bilateral development finance institution, civil society organization, NGOs. I mean, we had a whole cast of characters to really come up with, and what does sustainability mean when it comes to infrastructure? And so we looked at a number of different dimensions and a number of different parameters, and we looked at 21 different frameworks from the EU taxonomy to 21 of them, a whole bunch of them, and we went through them to come up with this sort of standardized way of looking, engaging. What is sustainability? Investors can make their own decisions on what that means, but here's a framework that provides at least a kind of a floor, if you will, with different kind of attribution aspects across different criteria for how one would define sustainability as it pertains to infrastructure. And that was a really great example of bringing together very, very diverse actors to influence private capital.
Perhaps we can have a new type of SIB, a sustainable infrastructure bond.
Thank you. Do we have time for one last question?
Yes, I believe we have one last question.
Great.
So for the last question, we wanted to turn it more to the individual. So we know the world isn't going to stop traveling anytime soon. It isn't going to stop consuming. So what can we do as individuals to accelerate the transition to net zero while still maintaining our economic activity?
Okay. I'll give a few pointers. I guess, but I think that these might become obvious. I know one thing that we're looking to do on our team, which I think is quite interesting, is, and it kind of goes with the theme that we've been talking about in terms of net zero and target setting and establishing a baseline, establishing a personal baseline for your own footprint. And so it's really the same thought process as it is for a company or a fund, but take a look at what you do. Take stock, and there's calculators that are available for free and public out there that can help you count, your emissions footprint. But let's do it personally. Get a baseline, get some historical data, a historical year. Think about the levers that you have that you can reduce. And there's definitely some easy ones like that, like don't drive a car, fly a little bit less. I know, Sebastian, you were talking about traveling more locally versus flying internationally, but I think data is power, and so let's do it ourselves too, and not just lean on companies to do it. Let's see what it actually takes.
Yeah, I agree, and I come sort of full circle back to kind of my initial comments in terms of, you know, there's international goals, there's country level goals and subnational goals and city goals, and then there's individual goals, right? So what are we actually going to do? So I agree with that. You know, certainly like in the workplace, like if there's one has to find silver linings, and if there was any silver lining in COVID, it was that we live in a hybrid world now, right? So we don't have to travel as much. So traveling less, certainly internationally, deciding what modes of transportation, you know, where you buy your clothes, where you buy your coffee. I mean, it's really all about individual actions, because again, it's the consumer, it's us as consumers that influence the corporates, as well as the shareholders, as well as the financiers. So I don't think we should underestimate, again, the power of us, for sure. Yep.
Well, let's give a round of applause to our speakers for tonight. Thank you. I'm going to take 4 extra minutes before we move on to the reception. I want to give you a teaser of what Friday is going to be like. And what's coming up next is a video prepared by our students. 2 of them were in the room sitting in the back, about the case that will make the Grand Challenge finale on Friday morning. And I invite all of you to tune in on Friday, and you'll see why. It's worth it.
Welcome to the 6th edition of the McGill International Portfolio Challenge, the world's largest buy-side university finance competition. Every year, the MIPC brings together students from over 100 university teams from more than 26 countries and all continents to tackle some of the most significant socioeconomic issues facing pension funds and other institutional investors.
We look for solutions to these issues that are pragmatic, creative, and address the needs of all stakeholders. Industry leaders are more eager than ever to solve these complex issues, and the MIPC provides students with the amazing opportunity to do so.
Hi, I'm Cinziana, McGill BCom 2022.
And I'm Anthony, McGill BCom 2023. Climate change has been a major problem for quite some time now, increasingly disrupting communities and ecosystems all over the world. But only recently has this issue really dominated the global spotlight, with several governments, corporations, and institutional investors making climate a top priority. Many of these organizations are responding by committing to something called net zero. But what exactly does this mean?
Net zero, also called carbon neutrality, means cutting greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, with any remaining emissions captured or absorbed. This creates a balance between emissions put into the atmosphere by human activity and those taken out. It has become the go-to strategy to limit climate change, with over 137 countries already making some sort of net zero pledge.
One country that has recently decided to commit to net zero by 2050 is Australia. The devastating 2020 bushfires fueled by climate change prompted a push towards sustainability. However, Australia is the world's 14th largest greenhouse gas emitter and is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, especially coal. As the urgency to mitigate climate change grows, many are looking to the retirement savings of Australians to help the country reach net zero.
With 1.5 times Australia's GDP invested into pension funds, also called superannuations, institutional investors have a significant impact in the fight against climate change. Many of these super funds have also made similar net zero commitments for their investment portfolios, working alongside governments and corporations to decarbonize the economy.
This year's case will focus on a fictional Australian superannuation fund called Super Easy. Super Easy was created 30 years ago and has since grown to manage the retirement savings of over 1.3 million Australians, investing $150 billion internationally in both public and private asset classes. But unlike many other super funds in Australia, Super Easy has not yet announced a net zero commitment.
This is where the MIPC participants come in. As consultants to Super Easy's senior management team, students will be responsible for 2 main deliverables. The first is to design a transparent, attainable, and well-defined net zero pledge that will satisfy Super Easy's members and have a positive impact on the environment.
The second and potentially more challenging piece of the case is to develop a comprehensive decarbonization strategy for Super Easy so that it can reach its net zero goal. And for such a large fund invested in everything from real estate to public equities to fixed income, decarbonization is no easy feat. For example, should Super Easy sacrifice diversification in order to meet its net zero goals? And how can the fund deal with a lack of ESG information for certain asset classes? As participants parse through the details of their pledges and work to solve one of the most significant challenges faced by pension funds, we invite you to join us live for the grand finale of the MIPC on November 4th. The solutions from this year's edition have the power to influence decisions made by pension leaders around the world, hopefully providing some reassurance that a sustainable future is possible and profitable. Thank you for watching and see you at MIPC 2022.
Thank you for watching and see you at MIPC 2022.
That's McGill Talented Play. All right, thank you all for tuning in and watching. We have a gift for Laurie and Fanny. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. And we invite you all to have a drink, to have some food. Let's connect, let's talk, and I hope you enjoy the event.